So, happy Memorial Day.
To you too.
And I say happy. It's not going to be the topic of today's message, but certainly deserves acknowledgement. And it's a day that many people lose sight of it. And what on a side note here, and I'm not going to chase this rabbit very far, but if you look at the major holidays we celebrate, of course, holiday comes from holy day, when we the way we say things in English. But if you look through American history, every major holiday or anything that we do in honor of veterans, some special person, some special occasion in our history in America, a progressive politician has made efforts to move it to a weekend. Especially if you look up Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was not originally on a Thursday. It was actually a day that fluctuated every year. It was on a specific day of the month, so it never always fell on the same Thursday every year like it does now. And it's very similar with Memorial Day. And there's a history to Memorial Day going back into the 1800s, after the Civil War. And it was, again, a day that fluctuated during the week, and it was a progressive politician at some point that said, maybe we should make a long weekend out of it, so let's put it on a Monday. And so now what has happened with Memorial Day is it's a weekend to cook out and barbecue and rest and relax. And so the average person out there doesn't even cross their mind to be thankful for the people who have laid their life down for this country throughout the history of it in 250 plus years. So 249 years, give or take. I know it's 250 years for the Navy. Marine Corps is like 251 or something. So, and those were started before we officially won our independence. Either way, we owe our freedom in this nation to people who were willing to lay down their lives. And for those of us that have served, we all know somebody, which I'm thankful that my friends, we all made it home. But I know that they have friends who did not. And I was listening to a guy named Jocko Willink, who was a Navy SEAL commander that led the invasion of Fallujah. So this was back in early 2000s. And he's got this really great podcast on leadership, and he talks a lot about military stuff. And he interviewed the parents of a Navy SEAL who died in the Middle East in 2007 while on deployment, and his best friend died several months later on the next deployment. They're both buried together in Arlington National Cemetery. But there was a point where this man's son was asked, or a statement was made by a friend of his that, hey man, you just break your leg and not go on this deployment. And he stopped and he thought about it, and they were at a football game or something. They were out there with a bunch of other people, but at some point shortly after that statement was made, he looks at his friend and he says, I'm the one who's trained, I'm prepared, I'm qualified. If I don't go on this mission, if I don't go on this deployment, then somebody who's not as trained, somebody who's not as qualified, somebody who's not as prepared as me has to take my place, and that's much more dangerous to everybody around them. And that's a very true statement. But then he said this, if not me, then who? And as we take time to acknowledge the people who have sacrificed themselves, and any of us that have ever put on a uniform, we've all, whether we knew it or not, subconsciously asked that question, if not me, then who? Some folks, like this young man that passed away in 2007, this young Navy SEAL, he was very conscious of it in that moment. And there's a lot of people in this country, thank God, still, And when you look back at the fact that it only took 3% of the American population to win the Revolutionary War. 3%. And, I shared my video from last year's Memorial Day service that I did at another church. But we don't know how to do that unless somebody else shows us to do that. And I know a lot of people oftentimes scratch their heads and wonder why. And I've been asked that very same question. Well, I don't see how you could do that. Why would you put yourself out there and potentially sacrifice yourself? I couldn't do that. I don't see how you could do that. As well, I understand a little better because of the question, if not me, then who? And as we are in service to the Lord, which is a far greater calling than to be in our service of our country, which is still a great calling in and of itself. And we had this discussion. I went to the men's breakfast at Lowrytown this morning, and they're getting things ready to look at their new year for their nominating committee. And it occurred to me that if you want to get more people thinking about actually actively serving in their churches, then the question you've got to propose to them, if not you, then who? And as Ronald Reagan said this years ago, that we're just one generation away from losing our freedom. And when you go back and look in the Bible, and you look in all throughout the Bible, they're just one generation, and we see it happen in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. They're one generation away from losing the blessing of God. And we see that with what Isaiah is doing here when he's warning the Israelites, when he's warning King Uzziah. And if we don't teach the next generation, there won't be a next generation. And so I am so thankful that there are people out there in the history of America, in the history of the world, in the history of Christianity and Judaism, who were willing to answer that question, if not me, then who? And put themselves out there in service to God and country so that we have the freedom to do this in English as opposed to German or some other foreign language. But it definitely is not the message for today, but certainly something to be acknowledged and appreciated and understood. Some gave all gave some, but some gave all. You see that in a lot of veterans groups. And so again, a big thank you to those who have sacrificed, the ultimate sacrifice. And of course, always points back to Jesus, whether you realize it or not. He is the one who truly would put himself out there for people who rejected him and spit on him and just, people that didn't deserve what he did for them, yet he still died for them. So we're going to continue on in the book of Isaiah. We're up to chapter 2. And some of these titles I'm borrowing from my Bible, and then most of these Bibles are out there, kind of follow the same titles for these different passages. There's 22 verses in chapter 2, but we're going to look at the first 5. We'll deal with the other ones next Sunday, referring to the mountain of the Lord. And I said this a few weeks ago, and again, this is my personal thing. It's not specifically in the Bible. It's not a salvation issue, but I really honestly believe that Mount Zion, that where the temple is built, that's like God's favorite spot on the whole entire earth. That's the spot he picked, and I think that's before the flood. I think that's where the garden was. Not that it matters, but it's central. So Mount Zion is central in Israel to a lot of prophecies. It's central to, again, prophetically speaking, what's coming in the future. And we're going to see that. And of course, Jesus talked about it a lot. And we'll look at that too. It's Sharon and I were talking in the car on the way here, and a lot of people's eschatology, their viewpoint or study of the end times stuff that they call eschatology, is really kind of screwed up because we jump from passage to passage. People want to sit there and assume that the book of Revelation is not linear, that it jumps around. And I don't read it like that. When I just read it plainly, without trying to put any extra stuff into it, no matter what anybody else says, but when I read Revelation plainly, it's laid out in a sequence, an ordered sequence of events. And as I believe that it spells out that the rapture is going to happen, which the rapture happens, as Paul says, is in the fullness of the Gentiles, which is the end of the church age. So when the very last Christian to ever be saved is saved, that'll be the moment for the rapture. The rapture then, because, and there's a lot of us that believe this in some form or fashion, but it's because the church is here now. That's part of the restraining hand of God upon the evil that's out there. So the rapture happens, the rapture will take the church out, and then begins the tribulation, which we know to be a 7-year period of time. Jacob's trouble, as it's called also. So when that happens, with 3.5 years into it, there's going to be another temple built. So the third temple will be built. And of course, the temple is there on Mount Zion in the heart of Jerusalem. And at the end of that 7-year period is when the second coming of Christ. And we always hear people talk about the second coming of Christ, and a lot of people get it confused with the rapture. Rapture is not the second coming. Christ doesn't actually set his foot on the ground. He stays up in the clouds and calls up his church to him. So the second coming is also at the Battle of Armageddon in the Valley of Megiddo. And so Christ will step down on earth with his army, and love the description, but the flaming sword coming from his mouth, which we know from elsewhere in the Bible that God's word is sharper than any two-edged sword. So it's going to be a battle that happens just that quickly. And at the completion of the Battle of Armageddon, Christ will then reestablish the throne of Israel, the throne of David. And he will take his place in the Holy of Holies, sitting on the throne in the third temple, and begin the millennial reign of Christ. The millennial reign of Christ gets neglected tremendously. And people like to skip the rapture, talk about the second coming as if it were the rapture, and then jump from the second coming to heaven. And of course we know from Revelation 21 and 22 that New Jerusalem will come down out of the clouds. So heaven will enter into our universe, onto the earth that has been renewed. I don't believe it's going to be just utterly obliterated and destroyed and reformed. I think it'll be similar to a forging process. Yeah, that was mentioned in chapter 1, smelting the dross and cleaning out the impurities. I think the earth will be remade by fire, which is mentioned in Revelation. And then when it's made new, New Jerusalem will be there, right? So, said all that to go back and look at what Isaiah said, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Verse 4, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Dear Heavenly Father, we just come to you today with thanksgiving in our hearts, dear Lord, for your sacrifice, dear Lord, as the example to be for those who would come after you in service to you, dear Lord. We just thank you for the sacrifice of the many soldiers, dear Lord, that have given their lives that we may have freedom here in America. And we pray that we continue to acknowledge you, dear Lord, that we would continue to have our freedom here in America, that we would be able to further your kingdom, preach your word, and teach your word, dear Lord. And we just ask that you would be with us in this service, be with us in this church, dear Lord, as we seek to further your kingdom. Be with those out there, dear Lord, that would step up in your name to do your will and your duty and your work, dear Lord, as you call us to do. Help those of us out there to not be dismissive, but to be mindful, dear Lord, of if not me, then who? And I pray that that would be put upon the hearts of all your servants, dear Lord, that we would go out in service to you. And we ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So, this is specifically referring to Judah. And of course, Isaiah is prophet to Judah, to the southern kingdom. Now, interestingly enough, at the same time, they overlapped to some degree, but the prophet Micah, if you go to Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, you have an almost identical prophecy. So God gave the same prophecy to Isaiah that he gave to Micah, references the same thing. So if you want to go check that out, you can. But verse 2 there, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, shall be lifted up above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. In order for that to happen, and we have the advantage of the whole entire Bible, we can read the whole entire thing, and we can see what events need to happen that get us to this point. But this is specifically referring to, the mountain of the house of the Lord. That's the hill that the temple's on. Temple's always been the house of the Lord. And, even going, like I said, in my mind, and I could be wrong, I'm open to this. It's not a salvation issue, but in my mind, all the puzzle pieces fit together to tell me that Eden was on the same spot. The temple, the tabernacle was built to move around, but when finally it came down to Solomon to build the first temple, that he built it on the same place that the garden was. I think this is, when Abraham came through and gave offerings to Melchizedek after rescuing Lot in Salem. All that's in the same place as Salem, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is just up the hill from Salem. There's so much stuff that happened there prophetically and historically this is a very special place. Even if that's not where Eden was, who cares really? But it speaks to me that this is a very special location for God. This is where he's chosen to put his Holy of Holies. And of course, the Holy of Holies we know is the place where God would come down and commune with mankind when they were right with him. When we're righteous and we're able to enter into the Holy of Holies, all throughout the Old Testament, this is where God would commune. And it's where the Ark of the Covenant is, which the Ark of the Covenant contains the mercy seat, where God's presence would be. And I believe this is where, at the second coming and the establishment of the millennial reign of Christ, I believe that's where Jesus is going to sit on the mercy seat, because the Ark of the Covenant will be put back into the temple. Right now it's in hiding. They think maybe they found it. There's a lot of concern if it actually what has been found. There's a lot of concern at the potential for the war that would erupt between the Muslims and the Jews over in the Middle East, and that would have cascading effects across the world, to be quite honest. We see that today in how nations are lining up, politically speaking, against Israel or for Israel. And there are those who would say that they're in favor of Israel, but at the same time, they're making a deal out the back with the Muslims who want to destroy Israel as a whole. So it's a very interesting thing to look at world events and kind of reflect back into this time in our future. But this is, in all honesty, God could pick anywhere on earth. He picked Jerusalem, he picked Mount Zion, but he could put it anywhere. And Christ's presence could be anywhere. And everybody's going to come to him. So the location itself is not near as important as who picked the location and who will be at the location. And, it shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. So what you're going to have at the end of the tribulation period, at the reestablishment of the throne of David, and Christ establishing the millennial kingdom, you'll have the ultimate judge, the ultimate perfect righteous judge, who is able to actually enact justice, true, honest justice. And he'll be sitting on the mountain of the Lord. So it's a very important place. At the current moment, you have the Dome of the Rock, that the Muslims have claimed that land. They've made it, they put their own little temple up there. And Jews are not even allowed to come up there and pray. So why would you prevent Jews from praying in their truly most holy place that was there thousands of years before any Muslim was ever invented? So it's a very important place. The devil knows it, but the devil's going to be defeated. And so the mountain of the Lord will be established by God as a central place, and everybody's going to come to it. And when you reflect back on, like in Exodus, and you look at Moses, who was a type of Christ, and the way that he set things up for Israel to run. And matter of fact, the Jews actually talk about the seat of Moses, and their high priest would sit on the seat of Moses. And it's a very, very special thing for them. This is reflections of Christ sitting on his throne. And so Moses, being a Levite, was high priest of Israel for the Exodus. And, so where he would sit and pass judgment. And his father-in-law came along and was looking at him and was like, dude, you're really stressed out here. You need some help. Christ will not. Christ will be able to handle it. Now, Roman Catholics they haven't stolen the house, the seat of Moses. They have what they call the seat of Peter, which was supposed to be the same things, not quite. And I'm not going to chase that rabbit any further than that. But it's a very special place, and we're given these clues. Moses was told to do things in a certain way by God, and it's the same way that Jesus is going to do them as he sits upon his throne on the mountain of the Lord in Jerusalem, and all the nations will be judged, and all the nations will be taught from there. Again, it's a very, very important place. And people, and this is going to be the thing, when you enter into the millennial reign, it's not that evil's 100% gone, because you find out in Revelation that there's this peace for 1,000 years, and then there's a statement in there, and I really need to go back and look this up, but essentially mankind will sin again, but Satan has been chained up for 1,000 years. So as mankind continues to sin, they're going to figure out it's not you can point a finger at Satan and say he kind of started everything, but it took mankind to continue to do it. And despite the fact that the true enemies of the Lord, the Antichrist and the beast and Satan, everybody's going to get defeated at the Battle of Armageddon, but they're going to be chained up for 1,000 years. And at the end of that 1,000 years, they'll be unchained for the final ultimate battle where evil will 100% be destroyed. But mankind will still have enough clarity to see that Jesus is God and that he's sitting on the throne and he is the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so people will acknowledge that, and people will, of all nations, will worship that. It's when you get into studying the Battle of Armageddon and you realize how many nations, the whole world comes together against Israel. And unfortunately, America's part of that. We're not mentioned anywhere else in prophecy other than being part of the group of people that turns its back on Israel. And we know from statements in the Old Testament that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. But they're going to amass the world's largest army in the Valley of Megiddo. And you get into studying the geography of all that, the Valley of Megiddo is a place where many nations assembled armies. It's this massive valley. It's huge. And it was a place of travel. If it's not wartime, and during peacetime, it was a place where everybody traveled in and out of the Middle East, in and out of that region. But when it came down to wartime, it was a great place to put your armies to get everybody together and organized so that you could go and attack in whichever direction. And so that's what's going to happen in Megiddo, in that valley. And of course, Armageddon meaning the revelation of the Lord. That's where we call it the book of Revelation. It's actually the book of Armageddon. But Christ himself will be revealed. And everybody's going to see. And that battle is going to be that quick. But we have right now 190 acknowledged nations in the world by the United Nations. And this is a really interesting thing. The United Nations has verse 4 on the wall somewhere within their building. And of course, that's in New York City. Verse 4, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. It's amazing to me how, our Supreme Court has the 10 Commandments all over the place, posted in plain sight, yet Roy Moore wasn't allowed to put the 10 Commandments up in an Alabama courthouse, despite the fact that our federal Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. has the 10 Commandments on it, right? Well, at the United Nations, they have the second half of verse 4 on their walls. But the problem is, they want to get to that point of peace without going through God. They ignore those first 3 verses. They ignore the part where in order to get to the point of beating your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, in order to get to that point where all weapons are dismantled, you got to go through God first. It's like the I guess you could call it a meme these days. No Jesus, no peace, right? Now, is it K-N-O-W, like knowing Jesus, therefore you know peace? Or you have no Jesus, therefore you have no peace, right? So it's how do you want to spell no? Wonderful thing about the English language, 2 words that mean completely opposite things, spelled completely different, but sound exactly the same, right? And I forget what you call that, but they want to get to the point of peace, but they want to do it their way. And as we have learned, thank God for President Trump, as we have learned, a lot of people have developed conspiracies and have conspiratorial leanings towards exactly what the United Nations is doing. We now know for sure that it's not conspiracy, it's truth, it's reality, that there's very corrupt people. The United Nations allows for other nations, specifically Muslim nations, to get up and call for the destruction of Israel itself, despite the fact that it's a sovereign nation. So we know that the United Nations is against Israel. It didn't take a whole lot of research to figure that out, and I don't make that statement lightly. The United Nations as a whole is against the existence of the nation of Israel. They're in support of Palestine, which wasn't a thing until the last, I don't even know, well, certainly the last 50 years, and going back into the 60s, probably 60 years, with the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a terrorist group intent on stopping Israel. It's in their charter that we're going to destroy Israel. Well, what's going to happen in Israel? The mountain of the Lord is going to be established by God, and this is where salvation comes from. Because Christ will put his throne there, and it's through Christ. Now, they all have this skewed thing, especially the Jews, where they don't believe the Messiah has come the first time. You and I know, we know that the Messiah has come once. That's why we talk about the second coming. And again, it's important to understand the difference between the second coming and the rapture. But the Jews don't believe he's come the first time, so they're still waiting for him to come, to show up. So the Muslims go along with that. And they've decided they're going to attack Israel and deal with Israel so they can stop their Messiah from coming. So they both got egg on their face. Although Israel is the chosen people of God, and that's the whole point of the tribulation. That's why the church age is going to end. The tribulation, the whole entire point of that 7-year time frame is to bring Israel back into fellowship with God. It's when you go through all of the judges and the different times when the nation of Israel has been sent off into captivity and dispersed and everything. And I was thinking about this a while back. I've always kind of had this question: is one of the conditions for, that would bring us up to the rapture and the tribulation, is one of those conditions that every single Jew on earth would return to Israel? And I believe I've actually figured that out, that no, it's not. It's not a condition, because when you go back and if you look at Nehemiah when he rebuilt the wall, out of all the how many millions of Jews, only 50,000 came back to reestablish the nation of Israel. So it didn't take all the Jews, because we still have a large Jewish population here in America, and there's a lot of Jews around the world, although a lot of them will return to Israel. They've been doing it since 1948. But, again, here we are. Like I said a couple services ago, you've got, so Israel was established in 1948. Okay, well, 40 years of generation. So around 1988 should be the second coming of Christ. No. 2000 is rolling along. No, we're still here. It's not then. So here we are 25 years later, and we're coming up on, this is 2025. I believe that, and we can come back and check on this, and then I can be a true prophet if I'm correct on this, right? I say that tongue in cheek. I don't claim to be a prophet of any kind. But when we hit 2033, when we hit around 2030, another 5 years, people are going to go nuts, because at 2033, it'll be quote unquote exactly 2,000 years since Christ was crucified. He's coming back. Now, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I have no idea. Nobody knows that. I'm not trying to be a prophet. I'm not trying to make any prophetic claim. I'm just looking at everything in the history of everything and going, it's a logical assumption. If you're one of those people that has to somehow figure out how to be relevant, or you got to be right about everything, or I don't stand up here thinking I have to know everything about the Bible in order to preach. I'm learning something new every day. But if I wanted to make a name for myself, I could start ringing those bells right now. I could be some kind of prophecy wonk, and I could be out there. There's people doing that today. You know, you had when Trump was in office the first time, we've got the Abraham Accords. And they built a building. And now this, unfortunately, is going to play into the end time stuff. It's going to play into the tribulation period where you're going to have one world religion. And there is this false belief that somehow Islam is an Abrahamic religion. It's not. It's not anywhere close. The only Abrahamic religion is Judaism. And it's not even, it shouldn't even be an Abrahamic religion. Now, Abraham was their father, and he's the father of faith. But it's only through Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. So it's only through Israel that salvation comes. And it's only through Israel that Christ is going to establish his throne on the mountain. And we'll see the fulfillment of this prophecy through Jacob, not through Ishmael, not through Muhammad or anybody else. And that's what's interesting is you go down, they built this building in like Saudi Arabia or someplace for the Abrahamic Accords. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have a part of that building, and there's people all worshiping together with a combination of all three. And I don't know if you remember or not, several years ago, Rick Warren got into this, unfortunately, but this thing, they called it Chrislam, like Christianity and Islam can combine and they're the same thing. No, they're not, no. The God of Islam is a completely different God of the Bible. And the Mahdi, as they call him, will be the Antichrist. But he doesn't come anywhere close to Jesus. Nowhere in the whole entire book of Islam, nowhere in the Quran, anywhere, does it say anything about God coming down and dying for Muhammad and his followers. But you go over to the Bible, Jesus died for us. He set that example, again, for us to lay down our lives for others that would not even think twice about doing the same thing for us. But Jesus is the only God in all of the pantheon of false religions in the world, in the history of the world. Jesus is the only God to ever actually come down and sacrifice himself for his people. He didn't ask his people to sacrifice themselves for him, although we might be called to do that. So the UN has verse 4 on their wall, but they want to get there without God. And, you know, it's when you look at that verse, it's amazing to me how we pick and choose, cherry pick as they call it. Verse 4, though, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And what a blessed time that will be. But that's not going to happen until God is back on his throne, on the mountain of the Lord, in Jerusalem, in Israel. And when we are looking at all this, if you look at John chapter 4, and Jesus encounters the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And that's an interesting passage because there's actual debate because that does not show up until later manuscripts, whether that was actually originally in the Bible. Wow, our power just went out.
Must be clouding on up.
Who knows? Well, I'm still recording. That's battery powered. But if you look at John chapter 4, around verse 21, and he and this Samaritan woman are having this discussion, and the Samaritans were half-breed or half-blood Jews. And so that's why the full-blooded Jews didn't like to go through Samaria, because they didn't like people that were bigots, really, unfortunately. Of course, Christ taught them better than that. But it's verse 21, chapter 4, John chapter 4, verse 21. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." And that's actually reference to the church age. But the Samaritans had a debate, because they were part Jew. Do we really need to go down to Jerusalem to worship God? And thank God that you and I, as Christians during the church age, we don't have to go to Jerusalem to worship. It's, if you can ever get a chance to visit, that's great, and it's a neat place to go to, and I would love to get there one of these days. But true worship of God doesn't have to be done in the temple because of Jesus. And that's actually another, we debate whether or not the law is applicable, or do we have to go by the law of God. As Christians, we're not Jews, but that's an interesting debate. When Christ said he came to fulfill the law, he didn't come to abolish it. And so I'm curious as to what that looks like during the millennial reign of Christ, as Christ is seated on the throne. Will there be a need for sacrifice, or is that completed and finished with Christ, which is kind of the direction I lean, but it's still something worth digging into and looking at. But then the rest of the law, will that apply? So that's an interesting thing. Like I said, the millennial reign of Christ gets ignored greatly, but we have a promise, we have a prophecy from God that he's going to come back and he's going to establish his throne on the mountain of the Lord. And it wasn't just, like I said, it wasn't just given to Isaiah. This prophecy was given to Micah as well. And so, as we go on about our day-to-day lives, our day-to-day business, as we go about seeking to serve the Lord in his kingdom as his representatives here on earth, and there's the power, which I think we got the internet back in the middle of this message. Finally. But I'll just have to upload this like I always do. But as we remember the fall, remember those who have sacrificed themselves, we remember that Christ sacrificed himself for our freedom, not from worldly things, but our freedom from sin and death and hell and the grave. This has all been planned. It's all been part of absolutely amazing. God exists outside of space and time, so things happen in a moment. And so for us here, from the moment time began, he had this whole entire plan worked out. And he knows what's going to happen and when's going to happen. He knows who's going to do it. And of course, being the all-powerful, all-knowing God that he is, he knows he will be victorious. There's no question. So you and I as Christians, we don't need to walk around sour-faced and defeated. What does Roscoe say? Mule chewing on a sawbriar? Or we want to walk around like we're weaned on a pickle. That's another one. But we do need to acknowledge our part in this whole entire plan. God has chosen us to spread his word and keep his word alive. And we need to ask ourselves that question I asked at the beginning of the service. If not me, then who? If if it's not me spreading the word of God, if it's not me spreading the gospel, the good news of Christ, if it's not me doing that, then who? For the churches out there that are getting ready to start working on their nominated committees, and when we get more members, if it's not me that's going to teach that Sunday school class, then who? If it's not me that's going to be a deacon, then who? If it's not me that's going to be a worship leader, then who? If it's not me, then who? And there will come a time, as Isaiah said, there will come a time when it will be so obvious because Christ will be there. He's going to be revealed. Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo. The revelation, the revealing of Jesus Christ to the world as the Lord of Lords, as the King of Kings, as the commander of the greatest army anyone's ever seen. God's will be done. And it'll be done from the mountain of the Lord. And this is, as we're going to see next week, he's laying it out that this is what we've got. This is what's going to happen. Woe to you. Look out, because you're not righteous enough for that yet. Isaiah is each chapter is like separate messages. So it's like his collection of sermons. The prophecies that God gives him, and every time he goes and speaks, because you'll see that in different chapters, that it'll be a prophecy of Isaiah concerning this, that, and the other. We're going to get a lot of stuff, and he's going to give you the good, but he's going to give you the reality, which is the bad for us, is that as a whole, we've turned our back on God. And we need to do that repentance thing and turn back to him. And then, and only then, and only through God, then can we look at verse 4 and get to that point of beating our swords into plowshares. But it's only through God that we're able to do so. You and I can't do it. Satan sure as heck isn't going to do it. The United Nations, which a lot of them are working for Satan. He's the king of this world. He's the god of this world at the moment. Little g God. False god at that. So as we go out and have our barbecues this weekend, I don't know, so many, there's all kinds of statistics on how many people own a grill and how many people are going to cook hot dogs, how many people are going to cook hamburgers. I would ask, how many people are going to go out and share the Lord? You're going to go sit there with your family and have this great cookout, or are you going to go out with your friends and have this great cookout? And maybe in the middle of cooking out, you might go, there's some people that died so I could do this. Well, that's cool. Give me another beer. But there's one who set the example for them. Are we going to acknowledge him?